All right, what's up, AP Psych? Welcome to your first set of flipped video notes on Unit 1. This is going to be research methods. In this video, we're going to be focused specifically on perspectives and subfields of psychology, kind of giving you a good overview of what is psychology. But the great thing about flipped notes is you're going to get a chance to pause when you need to, take your time, move through at your own pace, go back, and get things that maybe you missed, which is something I encourage you to do, especially as you're answering questions as you go through these notes. You can stop and look back, and hopefully those questions that you're answering, you'll be able to get correct because you'll have as much time as you need to answer them. So the flip notes are a great thing. That way in class we can come in and do a lot more application-based activity and things like that. I'm Mr. Kinkley. Some of you may be in Miss Barry's class watching this. If you are, it's because we've had an update to some of the curriculum, so we're redoing a few videos, updating them, making sure you're up to date on the newest curriculum and where things should be. So you may see a little bit of a mix of her and I throughout the semester because we are doing it together. So let's get into our first video on what is psychology, really just the basics and the perspectives and subfields. So first up, contemporary psychology. That's what we're really focused on now. We define psychology today as the scientific study of behavior, what we do, and mental processes, our inner thoughts and feelings. And that's what we're going to focus on the entire year. How do we explain behavior and mental processes, and what does that tell us about human psychology and human nature? So within psychology, one of the major debates is nature versus nurture. And you may have heard of this before. It's a controversy over whether human traits and behaviors are based on biology, nature, or one's environment and their experiences, or nurture. Okay, so this is still a big debate today. What's more influential, our genes or our environment? Okay, now, spoiler alert, it's going to be both, right? They both have about an equal impact on how you develop as a human being and as a person, but that does not stop the debate from still occurring as to whether, genes or environment are more important. We'll get into that a little bit as we go, especially when we get through like the development units and things like that, but that's something to keep in the back of your mind, the nature versus nurture debate in terms of how do we explain our behavior and our mental processes in psychology. So some of those big questions that come up, which is the cause of these things? Is it nature or is it nurture? Psychological disorders like depression or dissociative identity disorder, is that more nature, is that more nurture? We'll find out. Sexual orientation, there's a lot more clarity on this now than there was even 15 or 20 years ago. Is that nature or nurture? Our intellect, our intelligence, our IQ scores, things like that. Is that more nature? Is that more nurture? We'll find out when we do a specific unit on intelligence later in the year. And things like even becoming a serial killer. Is there a serial killer gene? I don't know. A lot of research being done on those things. What do you think? We'll find out the answer to those questions as we go in that nature and nurture debate. So, contemporary psychology. We're going to talk about 7 different perspectives here in a second, which are the most important baseline information for the entire course, really, right? But kind of combining, as you're going to see, all of those 7 into this one kind of cheat code approach to psychology. This is kind of the contemporary approach. It's called biopsychosocial, okay? And this is supposed to explain our behavior and our mental processes by combining 3 different aspects of ourselves: our biology, right? Our genetic predispositions, our genetic mutations, natural selection, how our genes respond to our environment, because certain environmental triggers can activate genes that hadn't been activated before. That's that interplay of nature versus nurture. So our biological influences, our psychological influences, the way that we think and perceive things around us, our emotional responses, our cognitive processing of what is happening in our environment, those things play a role, as well as our social cultural influences, the people around us, our peer group, our families, the schools that we go to, the neighborhoods we grow up in. They would argue today in contemporary psychology that it is all biological, psychological, and sociocultural. So all 3 of these things kind of come together to make us who we are, and they're really what describe our psychology and the way in which psychologists approach human behavior and mental processes today. Now, that being said, that does not discount these 7 current psychological perspectives that we're going to investigate throughout the entire year, and like I said, is going to kind of serve as the baseline for our understanding of psychology. Each one of these different perspectives approaches psychology from a different lens. right, or a different perspective of how they view human behavior and mental processes, right? And they investigate specific areas of those things to give us more information and to help expand our view of human society, essentially. So first up, we have biological or neuroscience. As I'm sure you can imagine, this is a very genetic-heavy, biologically focused, brain-focused perspective. In this, they're trying to understand how the brain and body create thoughts, emotions, memories, things like that. Right? It's all about the brain and how our central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and all of those biological aspects of our bodies make up our psychology, right? How our message is transmitted throughout the body, how is our blood chemistry linked to our motivations, questions like that. A lot of brain structures and information. So if you're someone who loves biology or who wants to be a neuroscientist or something like that, this is a great perspective that we're going to study in our second unit. Then you have evolutionary psychology, which is the natural selection process and how that has caused behavior and genes to develop and adapt over time. And in this perspective, they're asking, how does evolution influence our behavior tendencies, right? How does our choice of mate give us an insight into evolutionary psychology and the psychology of human behavior? Then you have the psychodynamic approach. This used to be called psychoanalytic way back when you may have heard of a guy named Sigmund Freud, one of the first psychologists. It's now been updated to psychodynamic, which is kind of the newer version. It gets rid of some of Freud's ideas that were a little less scientific, a little harder to prove, and honestly, a little bit more out there. But this is an emphasis on the unconscious mind as the director of all behavior, right? So how does the energy from the unconscious motivate our actions? What are those things happening below your conscious mind, below your pre-conscious, into your subconscious that's motivating your behavior? Trying to uncover those actions through different therapy techniques. Then you've got behavioral perspective of psychology, how our behavior is shaped by the learning process. We're going to have a whole unit on learning and mostly behavioral psychology. We're talking rewards and punishments and classical conditioning and observational learning. How do we learn to fear particular objects? How can we change problematic behaviors? That's all done through behavioral psychology and the behavioral perspective. And they would say, forget all of this biological, unconscious mind, internal stuff. In behavioral psychology, they believe that you have to be able to see changes in behaviors and see everything must be observable, right? And if you can't observe it, they're not worried about it. Then, kind of on the flip side of that, you have the cognitive perspective. And cognitive is just a fancy word for thinking, right? For thought. So it's all about how we think and perceive the world around us. So you've got how we take in, store, and retrieve information, and how our perceptions influence our actions. Okay? So questions they might answer: how do we use information to remember? How does interpretation impact behavior? How do we store memories and pull up information that we have stored, right? This is going to be a great perspective. It's going to teach you guys a lot about how to study the right way, how we can make information stick, and how we perceive our environment and how that impacts the way that we behave. Then you have humanistic psychology. This is kind of like a little bit like the hippie perspective. It came about in the 1960s. It's an emphasis on human growth and potential and self-concept and things like self-esteem and self-worth. And they would believe and say that every human is trying to become the best version of themselves and reach self-actualization. And that question is, how can I make myself a better person? So this is the very positive view of human behavior and mental processes, saying that and arguing that all humans are constantly trying to evolve and become a better version of themselves and reach their self-actualization. And finally, you have social cultural, which I'm sure you can kind of guess based on the name, society and culture. Human behavior must be interpreted in the proper social and cultural context. All right, so this is the very, biological perspective was the very nature side of things. Social culture is the very nurture side of things. How are various ethnic groups alike and different? How are social influences different across cultures? Why do we see a much higher prevalence of certain mental disorders within certain societies or cultures and not in others, right? Those are questions that come down to the society and the culture that people grow up in and the environment they interact with on a day-to-day basis. So it's also a very interesting perspective to investigate. So those are our 7 major perspectives. Now we're going to get a little bit into kind of like the subfields of those and what they do. So you have, first up, these different subfields have something called basic research. And in basic research, what you're doing is you're trying to expand the knowledge of that field, right? You're not necessarily trying to solve a problem or have a practical application, but you're just trying to expand humanity's understanding of, for example, biological psychology. So in these subfields, if you're doing basic research in biological psychology, you might analyze the connection between the mind and the body, right? And try to figure out, hey, what's happening biologically when these psychological events are occurring, right? And what's the biological connection to that, just for further information. Or on the developmental side of things, studies how behavior and mental processes change over the lifespan. We're going to have an entire unit on this, how children develop, when are their critical periods for language and walking and different things like that. What is occurring during early, middle, and late adulthood, right? And how people perceive the world around them and how their interpretations of the world change as they grow and develop from womb to tomb. Okay. Then you have cognitive. We talked about this a little bit, but how we perceive, think, and solve problems. A lot of research going on in terms of memory storage, and cognitive processing. You have personality psychology, investigates our persistent traits. Does our personality stay the same, or can it change across our lifespan? That's a question we'll get into later as well. And in social psych, they explore the many ways in which people influence one another. Right? And we'll get into a whole unit on specifically social psychology and conformity and obedience and compliance and these different things about how people interact with one another. So psychology subfields in terms of research, this is the split if you were going into that basic research side. Developmental is the biggest in terms of percentage of the workforce, and then you have social, experimental, and cognitive is not small either. On the flip side of basic research, we've got applied research. And these are the psychologists who are taking that basic information, the learning about the field, and they're saying, okay, what problems can we solve with this information? How can we apply this to human behavior and mental processes out in the real world? So you have industrial or organizational psychologists. They study and advise on behavior in the workplace. So they're going to try to make the workplace as efficient and as friendly as possible to the worker. Right? If you heard those things like Google talking about, how they have open workspaces with nap pods and places that people can collaborate together. That's industrial organizational psychologists would have consulted on the creation of those workspaces to make them as efficient as possible and as work-friendly as possible. Then you have sports psych, works with athletes to help them maximize their performance. Simone Biles in the Olympics, she's been very open about work with her psychologist and working through problems and things like that she had at the prior Olympics in Tokyo, when she kind of got the spins and lost her sense of direction and she couldn't land any of her gymnastics anymore and she had to work through that. Sports psychologist kind of works with that as well. A lot of athletes, especially professionals, are using sports psychologists to help them work through any issues they might be having on or off the field. School psychologists, we have one of those at Ralston Valley, has the expertise in the problems of teaching and learning. So this might help a student who's struggling with executive functioning skills, how to organize, how to stay on top of their studies, maybe even things like you're dealing with dyslexia. You might talk to a school psychologist, those things that are happening in the teaching and learning context that someone needs help with. A counseling psychologist, this is going to help people cope with academic, work-related, marital challenges, things that are not necessarily mental disorder issues, but they're still serious issues that people need to work through and figure out how to navigate in their lives, right? That's kind of a counseling psychologist helping with those day-to-day issues that are troubling people. And then you have clinical psychologists. They're going to study and assess and treat people with psychological disorders. They're going to figure out, hey, what is this person going through? Does it rise to the level of the severity of a psychological disorder? And if it does, how are we going to treat that? One thing about a clinical psychologist, they're going to treat people with something called behavior modification. They are not going to be able to use medicine or drugs because they're not certified for that. And we'll see that in the next slide. Okay. So here's some of psychology's applied subfields, the number of doctorates that were awarded in a year. So you can see in this area, clinical psychology is by far the most popular in terms of doctorates being awarded. Then you have general psychology. That might be counseling psychs, things like that. Counseling psychology over here as well. Industrial and organizational psych, school psych, educational psychology, doing educational studies and things like that. So there's a wide range of things you can do with a degree in psychology, but by far the most popular is becoming a clinical psychologist. All right, and finally, there's just a quick differentiation we need to make between a clinical psychologist who is a doctor, but it's a PhD, right? They study, assess, and treat troubled people who have mental disorders, but they do it with psychotherapy, talk therapy, behavior modification, things like that that we will get into later in the class. On the flip side, you have a psychiatrist who is a medical doctor, right? They have to go through med school. They have to do specific, what's the word I'm looking for here? Specific rotations and residencies and even fellowships in psychotherapy and the treatment of mental disorders, so that when they're done, they have a much wider understanding of biology and the human body and brain, because they went through med school, right? They have to go through med school, which clinical psychologists don't. So after all of that training, they are then able to prescribe drugs, right, and medication, which is something clinical psychologists cannot do. Okay, so that wraps up our first set of video notes. Please go back, check things out if you need to. Take your time. Please let us know if you have any questions so that we can go over them with you. There's a great spot at the end of your notes for a summary and for questions, so please record questions if you have them. And one of the things we know from cognitive psychology is that quickly summarizing what you've just learned is a great way to make it stick. So if you have a 3 to 5 sentence summary you can write down just from memory of what we just went over, that's a great way to get started, right? We'll see you in class.